Assalamu alaikum and hello to my non-Muslim viewers. Today we're going to be talking about this book, Ibn Ishaq, and what he says, what Ibn Ishaq says about the Satanic Verses. So it's commonly said by Christian critics of Islam that the criteria of embarrassment works for the Satanic Verses because their argument is that and especially people like Samuel Green, David Wood, Sam Shamoun, they keep bringing up the Satanic Verses. So their argument is the Satanic Verses story is embarrassing. So why would, if people made up the story of the Satanic Verses, why would they make up a unflattering story of the Prophet Muhammad? And wouldn't that mean that the story is true? Because why would they make up this embarrassing or unflattering story to begin with? And why would Ibn Ishaq just incorporate that into his work? Well, Ibn Ishaq himself said that the story is false, and so basically Abu Hayyan al-Andulasi, who died in 745 after Hijrah, mentions about this story. Imam Muhammad bin Ishaq, the compiler of sirah, was asked. He said this is a fabrication from the heretics, and he wrote a book on the issue. And this is found in al-Bahr al-Muhit fi Tafsir, volume 7, page 526. And I'll leave that quote below. And why this is important is because this is basically, uh, this actually shows that the early Muslim writers, Ibn Ishaq, al-Waqidi, Ibn Sa'd, and al-Tabari, they knew that they were including false stories into their works, but they did it anyways to give a complete chronological order or complete stories, whether they were true or false. That's a different. They didn't care if the stories were true or false. They were just throwing everything out there to put everything in chronological order or try to make the Prophet Muhammad's life in chronological order. Later on, people found out that those stories didn't have isnads or chains of transmissions, or their sources were false, or the sources narrating those stories were fabricators or liars and things like that. Only later on, through the isnad, through the chain of transmission or the isnad system, that people start filtering out the true stories from the false stories. So, and another reason why this is important is because if you read the history of al-Tabari, volume 6, page 108, the same Satanic Verses story is cited. And who does al-Tabari mention in the chain of transmission, or what is al-Tabari's source for the Satanic Verses? It's Ibn Ishaq. It says al-Tabari, volume 6, page 108, says in the chain of transmission, Ibn Humayd, Salama, Muhammad bin Ishaq. So that Muhammad bin Ishaq means Ibn Ishaq. So basically, the earliest complete story of the Satanic Verses was from Ibn Ishaq. And and Ibn Ishaq himself said that this was a fabrication from the heretics, and he wrote a book about this issue. Now, the book that Ibn Ishaq wrote about the fabrication of Satanic Verses, it hasn't been found. But the fact is, Ibn Ishaq did write a book at one point explaining why the Satanic Verses story is false. So that means that these early Muslim scholars knew that they were incorporating false stories about the Prophet Muhammad, but they didn't do. They included it anyway, and then later on, Muslim scholars did fact checking. They fact checked those stories, and they found that those stories were fabrication by liars or heretics or hypocrites, people pretending to be Muslims and stuff like that, to try to destroy Islam from within by narrating these embarrassing stories, or these unflattering stories. So the criteria of embarrassment doesn't work here. People made up these unflattering stories and these embarrassing stories for a reason. So people would, of course, make up these good stories and bad stories. Same criteria, same problem with Christianity. But I'll get into that later. So that's all I wanted to say about that. So even Ibn Ishaq himself admits that the Satanic Verses story is false. So when the critics of Islam, whether they're Christian, atheists, whatever, say that, well, Ibn Ishaq thought the story was true, that's false. Because Ibn Ishaq himself wrote um, how the story was wrote about how he thought that he wrote a book explaining why the story was false. So I just want to make a video explaining that the point that even the critics' sources say that that story is false. So even their source doesn't believe in the story. That tells you that um, that the early Muslim writers knew that they were incorporating false stories, and it was the later generations that weeded out the true stories from the false stories. So that's all I want to say about that topic. Thanks, so long.